So let us start the discussion panel now. The theme for today is entitled Community-Based Research at the Crossroads, Equity, Social Justice, and Change. And this is my big pleasure to introduce the moderator of the discussion today, Dr. Martin Taylor. Martin is CBRCanada board member. He is executive director of the Canadian Research Data Center Network. He is former vice president research at University of Victoria and one of the main facilitators of CBRCanada network since its inception. Also a great friend. Over to you, Martin.
Well, thank you very much, Joanna, for that introduction. And it is a privilege for me to be able to moderate this panel today. We are certainly taking on a big topic, but it, I think, nicely captures the fact that community-based research, by definition, addresses big challenges for society, whether that's locally, nationally, or indeed globally. And the equity, social justice, and change part of the title there, I think, reinforces the fact of the importance of the work that we do. And it also, I think, sets it in context because these are perennial issues, aren't they? I mean, there are obviously equity, social justice, and change issues facing us day by day, year by year. The particular form that they take may vary, both over time and by place, but they are with us, and they will continue to be with us, I'm sure, in one form or another for some time to come. So our agenda is large, and it certainly is not one that is going to disappear soon. So building the capacity for community-based research as a partnership between those of us in universities, those of us in community organizations, and those within other stakeholder groups within our society is a vital part of obviously seeking to provide solutions. Diagnostics are easy, i.e. what's wrong. Far more challenging is how we then address what is not as it should be in our society and make a difference. And as we spend this next hour, or a little less perhaps, on this panel, we are really privileged, I think, to have people who have indeed sought in their own work to not only address these challenges, but do so in a way that indeed does combine that vital combination of diagnosis and prescription, if I can use that language. Not only what's going on, how do we understand processes that underlie social, cultural, environmental, and other issues in our societies, but how do we make a difference? How do we bring about positive change in relation to these issues? So I'm joined today by a wonderful panel, Pauly from the University of Victoria, my former institution, Jennifer Adams from the University of Calgary, Jude Fransman, wonderful to have Jude with us, notwithstanding time zone being 5 hours ahead of us, so already well into the evening in the UK. Jude with the Open University in the UK, and Sam Tecle from the University of Toronto. So let's go just quickly through the group and allow them to introduce themselves very briefly, and then we'll come on to some core questions that the panel are going to address, both individually and collectively. So Bernie, start us off. Just a quick capsule, who you are as you come onto the panel today.
Thanks, Martin. I'm Bernie Pauly. I'm located at the University of Victoria. I'm a settler of Eastern European ancestry and have been living uninvited on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen people, specifically the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. And today I'm actually joining you from the beautiful territory of the Kwagluth, which is on the very northern tip of Vancouver Island, and also known as Port Hardy. So I'm truly in community today, and no surprise to anyone here, a community engaged, community-based researcher with a background in nursing and healthcare. So I'll turn it over to my next colleague.
So Jennifer, we'll move from literally the edge of the continent, somewhat inland, to Calgary. And Jennifer.
Hi, yes, my name is Jennifer Adams, and I'm at the University of Calgary. That is on, in what's known as Mohkinstsis, and it's the territories of the Blackfoot and the Kainai Nation people. And I'm originally from Lenape lands, also known as New York City, and a lot of my community-based work has been done there, and I'm starting to engage in some of that work here. So I am very happy to be here.
Thanks, Jennifer. So we'll keep going from west to east. So Sam next, Toronto.
Hi, good afternoon for me here. My name is Sam. I do research in Black diasporic communities and have been doing community-based research for a while now. So very welcome to be on the panel and share with you all today. Thanks for having me.
So now we'll jump across the ocean. And again, Jude, thank you so much for being willing to stretch your day to whatever time it is now. I guess it's 9:30 in the evening where you are. So welcome, Jude, and please introduce yourself. Your mic is off, but go ahead.
Thanks, Martin. It's a pleasure to be here, and I've got the privilege of having my kids in bed, which is always nice. So I'm based in the north of London, UK, in one of the most actually unequal councils in the country. Where extreme deprivation meets multi-million-pound houses. So it's a difficult but interesting area to live in. I'm a community-based researcher affiliated to the Open University and the Institute of Community Studies. And I work at the neighborhood level with a network of community researchers in my local social housing estate. Also at municipal and national policy levels, advising local government and the UK's public research funders, UKRI, on their community engagement strategy, until recently with Canada's NSERC, National Natural Sciences and Energy Research Council, and the societal value of their funding. And I also work at the transnational level with a network of international organizations, research networks, and social movements across Europe, Africa, North America, Latin America, and Asia, called the Rethinking Research Collaborative. Thanks.
Super. Well, I need to add no more to what you've just heard in terms of the breadth, depth, and caliber and experience of the group we've got. So thank you all for being willing to participate. So we're going to start off with some core questions, but as we do that, please, those of you in the audience, feel free to contribute to the chat as questions come to mind, as we go through some initial questions initially, and I'm sure to some degree our panelists will spark off each other, which is great. But we do want to allow good time for whatever comes through the chat to be part of this event. So we'll start picking up in many ways on the broad theme of the title of the session. So here's the question. Given the current major challenges we face globally, and we're well aware of them, and some of those, of course, demonstrate themselves regionally and locally, partly in the wake of COVID-19, the current financial uncertainty that we're hearing about daily, conflicts that very sadly are so much top of mind at the moment, as well as social injustice and discrimination, which are perennial, sadly, with us, and of course, the longer term and longer run impacts of climate change. In that broad context, from your different perspectives, what do you see as the role for community-based research? And then here's the test. What evidence from your own work can you cite that CBR really makes any difference? So Bernie, start us off. Port Hardy certainly is an interesting context to speak to any of those issues. So off you go.
I guess being on the West Coast, we get to start west. It is a broad context, but I'm going to zone in just for a minute on the context in which I work. I've been working in the context of substance use issues, and particularly looking at harm reduction and housing interventions. And sort of starting in that area, I had developed a very strong partnership with a number of local organizations in Victoria, one of them being a drug user organization called Solid, and another one which was a local harm reduction organization called it's called AVI, Health and Community Services. And through those partnerships were well established over many, many years, which is really the core to doing this work. But the context of that work is that in 2016, after about 4 years of rising rates of overdose deaths, British Columbia declared a public health emergency due to overdoses. In 2021, more than 2,200 people died of an overdose, often in their 30s and 40s. And disproportionately impacted were people that were homeless, people from Indigenous backgrounds and affiliations. And so we see yet again, the inequities repeated in terms of who is being impacted by that declaration. And so within that context, and you have to remember, this follows on, a housing and homelessness crisis. It follows on an HIV crisis that had preceded this in the 90s and early 2000s. So with that context, I just want to speak for a little bit about what have we done in that partnership that we created together, and how did that have impact, not only regionally, but nationally and internationally? Because many of us, working in community engaged work, we often start in our regional areas, but then it grows to international collaborations and partnerships, as you heard in the introductions. So when in 2016, when the public health emergency related to overdoses was declared, one of the very first things that was identified by Solid, the drug user organization, was that they had many of the interventions were being rolled out through people with lived experience, like take-home naloxone, for example. It was being rolled out provincially through them. There was some beginning interest and development of overdose prevention sites, which were really pioneered at that time. And many of them were staffed by people from drug user-led organizations, people with lived and living experience. And they were truly becoming, and were for many years, the first responders. However, they did not have access to many of the organizational supports that are often available to first responders, like, like equitable pay and days, mental health days, and access to employee services. And so I remember so vividly this day receiving a phone call and saying, our peers are out in the field and they're working. They're the first responders, and yet the media is saying, here's the first responders, the police and the ambulance, all of whom have employee assistance programs. We have none of that. So together with the British Columbia Centre for Disease Control, we partnered up together, and with some Health Canada funding, created a project called the Peer-to-Peer Project. And we started by just simply doing focus group with peers and asking them and saying, well, what would you need to support you in your work? And through that, we developed an intervention. And that intervention was implemented and evaluated in Vancouver and Victoria. And Now in 2022, we are scaling it up to 5 further sites. And what we've seen from that is people, they wanted recognition of their work, and we created resources around that. They wanted job descriptions, they wanted equitable pay, they wanted training. They wanted training in mental health first aid. They wanted training beyond just being able to administer naloxone. And so I think, you know, the evidence of that impact is contained, of course, in our reports, but it really addressed an issue that emerged as part of that. And, you know, as COVID, when COVID occurred in 2020, again, we had these partnerships in place. And the very first thing we did was we actually developed resources for how a suite of harm reduction interventions could be implemented in some of the hotels, because at the beginning of COVID, some hotels were purchased by the province here, and I know in other cities hotels were opened, but there was no template for how to do harm reduction services. So we actually created that and was taken up and used. And I'm, you know, there's many more examples than that, but I think it's the power of the partnership to be able to be responsive and to do the work that needs to be done during these times of crisis, and being nimble and pivoting for that kind of impact. And, you know, a lot of the resources that I've described to you have been taken up far beyond kind of our local sites and have been piloted in other areas. So that's some beginning thoughts to that really fulsome first question.
Well, that's excellent. And what I really like from that, and I'm sure others will pick up on it, is sustaining something out of an initial need, so that when the next problem arises, you're not starting again from square one, right? You've got an infrastructure of some sort in place where partnerships are a critical part of that infrastructure. Jude, take us there with your UK experience, where you've already given us a glimpse of the kind of area that you work in, the economic diversity it represents, etc. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I think we've all been really affected in different ways by the pandemic. And I think one thing which has really struck the networks that I've been working in is how context has really been reconfigured over the past few years. And what we've seen, certainly in the UK, is this move both to the hyper-local as people become more kind of restricted in neighborhood areas, but at the same time, a move to the digital and a kind of broader connection, both nationally and internationally through social movements and other either interest-based or identity-based networks as well. The network, the research group that I work in locally, most locally within this social housing council estate in a very deprived part of London, is really characterized by difference. And I think that's quite a tricky thing for a lot of research funders to get their heads around, because often there's an assumption that when you're talking about a community, it's characterized by sameness, whether that's one particular type of migrant group or ethnic group, or one a group experiencing something similar. And in our social housing estate, we have most people don't own or rent privately. They're either in publicly provided housing or sometimes emergency temporary housing, categorized as homeless. But they have all sorts of different migration status. Some are refugees, some have very temporary visas, some are citizens, second generation. They have very different types of households, different caring responsibilities, different employments. They speak different languages. There's a very strong Kurdish community, Turkish community, Caribbean community, West African, Somali community, Albanian community. And what we've been working on is trying to bring together cut across all these differences and bring together an action research network committed to exploring collective change in this locality, but also connecting with other movements and networks and organizations configured either nationally, internationally, or in other parts of London, in order to really push for the type of changes that we want to see, whether that's in relation to housing policy, welfare policy, migration policy, food security, or any other number of issues. And the way that we've done that is we've developed a community-based research training program, which is has 3 parts, and we've started really from the inside out. So the first part, we've drawn on autoethnographic and arts-based methods to encourage community researchers to explore their own circumstances, their own experience, expertise, their own traumas, and their needs and priorities within the community, also in their own families and their own networks. And after we go through this kind of very personal subjective research phase, collecting data over a period of time and sharing very selective extracts with the group, we then focus on difference, and we use strategies from peer research to look at how these experiences of others in the group, of our families and our neighbours relate to these very subjective positions. And then in the third part, we move to a kind of participatory action research, which includes a kind of critical asset mapping, but also kind of speculative futures-based methods, both creative and participatory, to reimagine the collective space, to look at consensus building across our different needs, priorities, sources of knowledge, and to think about how we can then bring in other people, whether that's local government, whether that's specific professionals with particular expertise, different types of researchers and different disciplines located in different places, to really push for a collectively agreed set of priorities. And we find that when we get to that final stage, because it has started from the inside out, the relationships, the trust built over the course of the process, and the consensus which we manage makes the action a lot stronger, and the commitment of the different people and groups who take that forward a lot stronger as well. And I guess I just want to say that the sort of big, both the opportunity and at the same time the challenge is within this, how you actually hold conflict, because at every even if you're just focusing on the individual, I mean, the levels of vulnerability is similarly to what Bernie was saying about the types of groups that you work with. The experiences are almost universally traumatic. The ethics involved in this type of group is so complicated. We all, we run a creche, most of us, not all of us, but most of us are parents, and our kids attend the sessions as well. They all kind of go to the same school and play together, and that creates a sort of leveling space where we can kind of build on the trust. We can imagine the space as a space that we want our children to grow up together in. But you have to kind of come with all the differences, all the kind of complicated inequalities and nuances, and be prepared to share that and to put it out there and be okay with the potential conflict that causes. And to do that, you really need strong relationships and enduring relationships. So it starts off really tricky, and you kind of have to feel your way. And I found that coming from a more traditional academic background into this space, I've had to like put aside a lot of the assumptions that I've brought with me about what proper research is, and be a lot more intuitive, pass over kind of control of the research to different people in the community at different points, sometimes professionals who come in and support. So there's huge opportunity, but also challenge, and the context is changing all the time. Different places and levels make more sense to work at depending on what you're trying to do. So it's again feeling that way, but really focusing on relationships throughout everything as the key resource.
So before I turn it to Jennifer, which I will in a second, just one follow-up. So what's impressive about what I'm hearing is you've obviously built trust, you've built capacity through these various staged approaches to what you're describing. So let me put the question, what difference has it made in terms of receptiveness, be it of local government or other authorities, I'll say, to bring about the kinds of changes you're trying to achieve for the benefit of that neighborhood?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most immediate benefit is for participants themselves, and these are people often who haven't been able to get jobs due to prison records, who are really kind of struggling with no entitlements to any welfare benefits because of the migration status. So coming together, feeling like you're a part of something, just having the opportunity to speak in public forums or with government in different spaces makes a big difference, and that sense that you're not alone, and that however small the steps we're taking, things are slowly happening. We're gaining spaces, we're kind of supporting local government to also make larger changes. That's a huge benefit. I think the local, we now have in our council, Haringey Council, a research and policy unit, and they've been very, very responsive to our work. So we've really supported them to then look at ways of adapting to other contexts within other social housing estates. And then I think just to send the message again that communities are different, and you kind of, you can't, representation is key. Like when you think about how you bring communities into research or policy, you have to think about who you're engaging with and what that means for the representation of the group that you think that you are connecting to.
Super, thanks. That's excellent to hear that. Over to you, Jennifer.
Yes, so I think a lot of the work that I've done has been more based in with schools and students, both in the formal and the informal context. So it's been about looking at these students as both members of their communities and members of the school. So I'm really connecting them to their communities through place-based education. And the most recent, I was working with one of my doctoral students who thankfully graduated. Well, first we started with what we called our Urban Environmental Research Coven. And through that, in response to what we were seeing that was happening in schools and a lot of these informal science community-based places, that the way that meritocracy and a lot of the neoliberal types of reforms and things were influencing what happens with students learning, the kinds of access, really truncating what they had access to, and especially in terms of science education and environmental education, really narrow ways of thinking both about science, thinking about sustainability, thinking about ways of being with the environment. And so we started to look at the ways that we were engaging with students, the types of learning spaces that we wanted to develop, both based on the theories that we were engaging with and both based on our practical experiences. So we came up with and we co-authored what we call the Crit Trans heuristic, and it's a way of approach to recentering place, land, and community in science and environmental education, again across contexts. And we developed 6 tenets, and we didn't mean this to be like a prescriptive type of thing, but something that would be a living and fluid document that would be, contextually adaptable to pace, depending on what people wanted to focus on. But the tenets include things like, thinking about contextualized and historicized knowledge, especially if we're coming from STEM and intersected with environmental education, where it's often presented as being this objective and neutral space when a lot of us know that it's very differently. So we're really trying to contextualize it, allowing students to learn and to know that these are not neutral things, that everything is up for being questioned, and especially juxtaposing this against a lot of the students that we work with in urban environments where they're experiencing things like rapid gentrification in their own communities that are forcing a lot of them to be pushed out. So really examining those historical structures that are contributing to that, and what can they do as members of their communities in, to develop agency in response to these different oppressive structures that are coming across, that are not only influencing how they are schooled and what they have access to in schooling, but also influences what happens in their communities when they get back to their communities. And so through our work, we've learned, or we've seen that when students get engaged in these types of ways in learning, not only do they become more interested in that learning environment, but when they start to see the ways that they have agency, whether that is in decision making around food choices in their families. Like, we can give one example where, there's a famous food co-op in New York City, and it's always been very, well, more recently, I should say, it's kind of perceived as being this very white, affluent space. But one of my doctoral student introduced the students to this space, and they realized that it's a space that they can belong to, where they can access a range of healthy foods and foods that they eat that they may not have as accessible in their communities, and they can have that kind of agency in introducing their family to those different opportunities, and also agency in seeing the ways that they live their lives at home that are actually in sustainable ways. I always like to use the example of seeing, you open up a tin of cookies, and that in many like Caribbean and Asian and other immigrant homes, you're not going to open it up and find cookies, but you're going to find other things that are carefully stored in them. So the ways that we have been living sustainably, but have not been necessarily recognized as such. So it's really about, with the types of community-based education and learning that I engage with along with my students, it's really about students like reclaiming their place in the community, reclaiming their agency around decisions that are made both at home and in the community that affect them, and also giving them that sense of agency and identity that they can pursue themselves, like paths to higher education that could help them increase their agency and being able to make and enact those types of changes that they want to see realized in their communities.
And just out of interest, I mean, what ages of students are you reaching?
These are high school students, high school and like the first 4 years of college. So I would say grades 10 through 16, if you want to consider the first 4 years, developmentally.
And one other follow-up question, and then we'll turn it to Sam. The response of the families, of the parents or other caregivers, how are you seeing the influence, if you want to call it that, of the kids getting this education working out in that wider family and community context?
Well, I mean, it goes both ways. I mean, we've seen a lot of positive changes where, families get introduced to the broader context of resources and things that they could access that they probably did not, or probably previously did not think was for them, either due to race or socioeconomic, exclusions or perceived exclusions. But then there's also on those change where sometimes students maybe come at odds with their family because there are some maybe political differences in the ways that they're thinking and growing. So there's different ways that we have seen, and we have not necessarily interface with the families as much, through individual relationships maybe, but really getting this information back from students in the discussions that happens in the space.
Super, thank you. Sam, over to you. Your experiences around these bigger questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to share. Yeah, so I think community-based research has a potential to meet this moment, to meet the moment that we're in. Yes, I've in a previous post, I've been teaching community-based research for a couple of years now. And in these last couple of years, we've had what some might call an attempted insurrection in the US on January 6th. We've seen George Floyd. We've seen racial protests on the streets. We've seen mass shootings. And I think community-based research, or at least these questions or these events, these moments have penetrated the classroom, I think, in my experience. And I think when I start this semester with students, I sometimes push the idea or critique the idea that the idea of community-based research or university community partnerships relies on the idea that these places are separate. Yeah, that something happens in the university and something else happens in the community. And this is the methodology by which we'll bring these together. I've never operated from that paradigm. So that's one. One experience I'd like to share that we've had in Toronto that comes on the heels of the power of the connections and the attachments we've made that cross these kinds of imagined boundaries is this most recent policy we've had in Toronto, where we've had police stationed in schools. enacted by a province and our city government and our trustees, which are kind of elected officials that oversee our public education system in Ontario, right? And this comes on the heels of a tragic death of a young Black boy in a school, right? So the province, you know, does this year-long, 2-year-long investigation, does consultations. We all participate as good community-based workers. And the result we get out of all of these 44 recommendations, none of which were police in schools, were police in schools. And of course, these were in racialized communities, mostly where police relations with community were fraught. So this took 10 years of advocacy and community building and community-based research of capturing stories of how unhelpful, to put it lightly, this policy was, right? And through community-based research, through trusted and attachments, all of the things, the tenets that community-based research tells us, we finally got a critical mass of voices that reached the agenda, the political agenda, right? Because there is a way, there is a paradigm that operates on community-based research between the university and the community. You know, much of what we uncover, at least in the work that I do with, you know, poor, racialized, Black, working class communities, are things that they've been saying for a long time. It's just that community-based research, and you know, Sam with a PhD, for some reason seems to give it a little bit more validation. And this community-based research methodology we used, that really attacked or kind of punctured the imagined divides between school board, student, community, university researcher, right? And we were able to bring to the fore this critical mass of students that were affected disproportionately by this policy. And that's what I think community-based research can do, is address the most pressing questions the most marginalized of our communities face, and attempt to mount research programs that support their cries, and they are cries for struggle and justice. Yeah. So I think community-based research can do that work, and it must in this moment. It must meet this moment. Thanks.
That's a terrific example, and it's a lovely segue actually to the second question we were going to pose to you, because each of you in obviously talking about context have also alluded to or specifically mentioned the influence of social movements. And to some degree, those social movements obviously are driven by particular events, signal events, some of which, Sam, you've just mentioned, that then spark, obviously, in some cases, obviously not just local, but national or even or global movements. And obviously with Me Too, with Black Lives Matter, with, in our case in Canada, of course, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and all of the recommendations out of that. I mean, all of this is obviously driving to some extent, or at least influencing, perhaps is a better way, our agendas. And so I'd like you to talk to that a little bit in terms of your own work. So how you see social movements of that sort informing the future directions, if not even the current directions of community-based research, and what can we learn from those social movements for community-based research practice and partnerships, which you've all emphasized. So Jude would start us on that one. So social movements and community-based research.
Sure. Yeah, I want to give an example of a social movement that I've worked with at the international level, and that's the Pan-African movement, Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity. And they work in a really bottom-up participatory way through citizens' assemblies across 6 different regions of Africa. And through those assemblies, they've developed a context-sensitive dignity index, which they use as their basis for both their programs. And they also have a training program, which includes one of the only masters in activism, based, that one's at a center, dedicated center based in Tanzania. But they, as well as working across Africa and being a part of a number of international knowledge networks, looking at how they can use this contextualized knowledge to inform whether it's research or national policy discourses or international development research and policy. They also connect with other types of social movements, and working with African diaspora groups. For example, in the UK, they've been working very closely with the Black Lives Matter Coalition and Action for Climate Truth to run a campaign demanding reparations from the UK for centuries of exploitation through slavery, colonialism and imperialism. But because they work through these other movements which have a space within different diaspora communities at different levels, they're able to both learn and share and connect, whether it's with research or policy or different kind of knowledges of different types of groups across these different levels, which for me seems to be a huge advantage, as long as the groups are connected and rooted in those different spaces. And we've been trying to draw, even in my local council estate-based network, we've been drawing on their resources to look at our own activism and to learn from these activists, many of whom don't have a secondary school education, never mind a university education, but work very closely with a number of research institutes across the continent. And I know for a lot of the those with African heritage within our groups, being able to learn and learn activism alongside knowledge mobilization from those based across Africa has been really inspiring too. And I think, one challenge just before I pass on with it in terms of engaging with social movements, I think for a lot of universities, at least in the UK, engagement with communities has traditionally either been through communities of proximity, so geographically based regions close to where the university is based, or with specific institutions or organizations for specific projects. And I think that while there's a huge amount of value to be gained from working with social movements, there's a bit of a challenge around representation, especially if that movement is dispersed across a country or internationally. And I think while it's a big challenge, because a lot of university research teams quite like to have a partnership which is fairly clear cut, one of the advantages of working with social movements is it does force a more kind of collaboration, a multi-layered collaboration across multiple universities and different spaces. Often universities, in the case of Africans Rising universities across Africa, as well as in other countries, universities in regions of the UK that might not have thought to engage with particular communities, and that challenges some of, certainly in the UK, there's a very competitive research system whereby there's a lot of incentive to attribute ownership of community-based research engagement to a particular research team, but through discussions with funders and recognition that actually the only way forward is to work in that more collaborative way across the university sector as well as across the community sector through movements. And I think what Sam just said about having to really dispel this myth that community and university are separate is so important. I think we're all kind of interlinked. Universities are huge resources for communities, a lot of learning for both students and faculty, academic faculty happens within community spaces. We all come from communities and carry elements of communities with us. So I think once you kind of, even in research funders, there are those kind of connections as well. So I think dispelling that myth and then thinking about how we reimagine the system in a more collaborative and productive way has to be helpful.
So Sam, take it from there. You've been given the cue, so thanks for that, Jude. And social movements and CBR in your experience.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. I think when it's important to also consider how important and resonant social movements are in of themselves for creating knowledge and mobilizing knowledge. Yeah, and thinking around the corner for what might be possible for us as a society, right? I always tell my students, I can assign a syllabus full of readings, and these readings are like the 4th or 5th or 15th draft of whatever movement or struggle or community that they're based on. The social movements that are active right now that we're learning from that are happening in our city. For a small example, Encampment Support Network in Toronto for underhoused folks. BLM Toronto is really active, folks around safe injection sites. The work that's happening in the city right now, we'll read about it in an article in about 3 to 5 years. Yeah. So this is the most recent cutting edge theoretical work, is not in the annals of our libraries or our journals. They're actually on the street. So I think that reframes, at least I hope for our students, what we might or how we might consider knowledge and its production, right? And so often I think community-based research, and I'll close with this one too as well, is that the courses that I've taught historically have been attached to placements as well, right? Students who have opportunities. So the question then not only is how do we learn from the important work that social movements are doing, which we should always be doing, especially in community-based research, but how to do that ethically, yeah, in an ethical manner that, as Jude said, collaborative, really collaborative, that attempts to address the power dynamics that are structurally placed. Yes, but we're still people. We don't follow these structures like automatons. So how do we do that, right? And the last thing that we know is the finite resource in community-based research to do it ethically is time. Yeah, sometimes it might not fit within a 12-week course. Yeah, so how do we do that? That's the question. I'm still grappling with that, but I think that's what's at stake when we think about, really imagining the university and community and social movements which work with our most vulnerable neighbors and residents and undocumented folks, elderly folks. How do we do this in a way and demonstrate to students to do this in an ethical fashion is the questions that we at this body, this panel, this association should grapple with. Yeah, thank you.
And just a quick follow-up there, an implication of what you're describing in terms of, in a sense, the datedness of what's in the latest, supposedly the latest article or the latest book, implies perhaps, where are your students? Are they out on the streets?
Very often they are, yeah. Sometimes they come to the classes like the ones I teach for a kind of validation of that work, yeah. Sometimes they find that through community-based research, and sometimes students are interested in what work they can do. And one of the most, I think, teachable moment was when a student said, I think part of what this readings or this work asks us to do is, what do we owe each other in a more ethical society? Yeah, what can and then that question I read was, or what I heard was, what can we do with and for each other, right, alongside each other? So I think community-based research courses, the syllabi, the methodologies that we have to employ, the ethical goalposts we have to hold, and the anchors we have to have, it's a challenge, but it's also an opening for us, and I embrace the challenge.
Super. Bernie, to you, you kind of took us partly down this route of social movements, particularly around some of the challenges that your work has focused on. So take us a step further, and we'll bring this to a close pretty quickly, because we do want to give some time for the chat questions from Sarah. But go ahead, Bernie.
I think where Sam and Jude started to take us is, down the road of various different social movements. And I just want to reflect for a minute on the social movement of CBR itself. And, the university, can hold up these ideals and say, we're about community engaged research, but it does come down to the scholars who are able to be in community, who are out in community, who are mentoring their students in the community context. And there's so much in our university structures that we really need to change in terms of support of that movement of CBR itself. And I mean, we're asking, I think back, I'm a full professor at this point in my career, but I think back to the importance of getting out those articles. And you're right, they're coming out a few years later, and people are saying, why did it take so long? Or, sometimes you're working in a way, like the way that I do my work, we're also working with community partners to write those articles, because the whole process through the whole research is that we are engaging with community researchers, and we are doing support and mentoring, and we're learning too. We're tremendously being influenced and learning about, community and living in the community and experiencing those issues as well. But the university, and it's not even the university, it's our systems of research who are looking for specific kinds of outputs. And, I can look at the work that we've done together around producing evidence that has informed interventions to reduce and prevent overdoses. And I think some of the most impactful have been those outputs that are in the form of an infographic, or that are in other forms that don't always count in the same way in the university. So we do have some work to do around that. And then I just want to sort of say that we're also in our, as mentioned by others, we're also in our own specific movements. Like I'm very much a part of the harm reduction movement. Yesterday we have BC as the first province in Canada for decrim. I've got on my decrim already shirt today for this, because I'm part of that movement too. And I'm working as side by side with service providers, with people with lived experience, to influence those policymakers, because this first approval of decrim is such a small step, and we have so much more work to do, and we're only going to be able to do it together through having evidence that's produced through using CBR methodologies and being together in the actual political policy realm.
Well, thank you, Bernie. I was hoping you would bring that up since it was so current and topical. I didn't realize you got the shirt on. We couldn't quite see it. There we are. Okay, Jennifer, over to you to close this one out. And then Sarah, I'm going to turn it to you to see what's in the chat. We've always got other questions that we can pull out of a hat very easily. But Jennifer, to you, just finish off on the social movement question.
Muted, sorry. They'll probably just reiterate a lot of what my other co-panelists have said. Well, first, just looking for social movements, especially since I'm more dealing with the high school age kids, is really looking at the social movements that are existing in the communities and why. First, like interrogating why do they exist in this first place, and that goes back to that notion of historicizing and contextualizing knowledge. What do these movements wish to accomplish? And then having students being able to engage with that from that standpoint of knowing why, asking those critical questions about who, what is happening, who is being influenced, who is being harmed, those things, like who is ultimately benefiting if this social movement did not happen. So really looking at all those different layers so that they have a more holistic view of why things are the way that they are, so that they can know what needs to be happening in order to make changes. And then thinking about us that are situated in the universities where we're doing this type of community-based research and collaborations, and if we want to do it in authentic and meaningful ways, how it is counter to how universities structured. So we have to really, especially those of us that are, mid-career senior people, and how can we change that? How can we really think about these tenure and promotion structures that really look at, X published articles, but they're not really looking at the necessity of these longitudinal engagements with community that require, trust building, require collaborations, require relationships. Those things cannot just happen in just the context of writing one grant. These are things that happen over a period of time, and through that period of time you become a member of that community if you're not already a member of that community. So there's a very different a very different type of commitment that emerges that with that, and how do you account for that in these types of hierarchical structures of the university that doesn't necessarily recognize that. And a lot of our students that are coming into universities now and in schools, they want to be able to make these changes. They want to be engaged in communities, whether it's their own communities or whether it's other communities. They want to be authentically engaged and working with communities, and not necessarily having that parachute approach of just going in and taking stuff and then leaving and turning it into some type of publication. So how are we going to be changing these structures in universities, both to accommodate the transformations that we, as researchers want to make in communities, and also the learning experiences that our students want to have, so that they could develop the agency and make the necessary changes that they want for better futures, both for themselves and for the communities that they come from and that they identify with.
I think that's a wonderful place to close this part of it. I mean, what you've all said, and Bernie and Jennifer, you've just captured it so beautifully, is CBR as a social movement in and of itself, and the ways in which it can be an influence to change within the university system itself, which is, Jennifer, just where you've gone. Having been in that system all my career and been at senior levels in it, and obviously have advocated for and helped to build to some degree CBR, at UVic and beyond. It's a slow process. It's resistant to change. And the same could be said, for our funding agencies. And we could have taken some time with questions around, getting resources and funding through traditional or non-traditional channels. But the fact remains, we are making a difference. And I think going back, Joanna, to where you started, introducing the growth of our organization, the number of partner universities. And Jude, when I think about what's happened in the UK, it's been a bit odd in some senses, and forgive me for saying that, in terms of the research evaluation exercise I'm thinking about. And 30%, right, of the evaluation, or was the case, maybe it's changed a little bit, on the basis of impact. And university faculty coming to people like you and saying, Jude, how do I show impact? And you say, well, what about CBR, right? And so there are ways in which you get openings, right? So your strategy takes advantage of opportunity, and that's how you grow the movement. And so wonderful, I think, that you've brought us to that point of CBR in and of itself being a movement, not theoretically, but practically in terms of making that difference within our institutions, let alone our communities. So Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, Martin. And thank you, Jennifer, Bernie, Jude, and Sam.
Absolutely.
What a fantastic panel, asking lots of important and provocative and critical questions that we need to be asking as we kind of move forward with community-based research and the work that many of us are doing with and alongside communities, and we're a part of many of those communities as well. So I received a whole number of questions by chat, and I'm afraid to say we won't be able to get through all of them, but I'm going to pose one, and I encourage folks whose questions we can't take up to stay during the post-networking portion of the event, and you can ask the questions directly to the panelists so we can continue the conversation. So there's a question from Madeline, drawing on the conversation of ethics that Jennifer, you had kind of addressed. And Madeline asked, for the panelists, I'm curious about how panelists advise community-based researchers to engage research ethics boards when developing community-based research projects. For example, dealing with the extended timelines, the importance of ensuring that folks with lived experience are foregrounded on study teams, et cetera. So I pass this, maybe I pass this off to you, Jennifer, since you had mentioned ethics, and then anyone else who wants to speak to this.
And yeah, and that's a very good question. I mean, because the ethics, and we know why ethics exists, again, thinking about that historicizing knowledge, because it has been the vulnerable communities that have been most affected. But then we also know that ethics do create barriers for doing community engaged work. So while it's not necessarily an easy answer, I think that it's really up to people who do community-based research to get involved with university ethics boards, so that those types of questions that often come up when they're reviewing these these ethics applications that come up can be addressed by people who know, and then leading to changes in how community-based ethics are reviewed, and knowing that for the most part, research that happens in and with communities is emergent. So you may not have like these very defined research questions and these very defined research instruments at the beginning. They will have a range of people that are going to be involved that are both within and outside of the university. So how does that come into play if you do want to list them as co-researchers with getting all of like the credentials required? So there's a lot of different questions that come up in dealing with the ethics. I know for myself, what I try to do is make the ethics as very, bland as possible, like very clear and very linearly written as possible, but knowing that the research, while, keeping, I guess, within whatever the ethics requirements are, but knowing that there are going to be spaces in the research that are not necessarily going to be align with how the ethics is defined or situated within the institution. But again, I think that that's where it's very important for those of us that are involved in this type of community-based research to get involved with the ethics boards, because those are not going away. They're always going to be those structures that exist, but it's up to us to change those structures so that they can fit what needs to take place and what, the types of research that needs to happen.
I can just go really quickly just to dovetail what Jennifer said. When I teach ethics, I just begin with the reality that it's founded in violence, particularly on marginalized community, right? So we can go through, the Tuskegee experiment, the prison experiment, Milgram's work. We can go through, all the Henrietta Lacks, right? So that's how I teach the production of ethics that stems from the institution, and the institution's ethics formation or offices is mostly staffed by lawyers, which are designed to protect the liability of the university. So I think but it's also a necessary evil, to use a philosophical term, to ensure that the study that we do with communities, marginalized especially, receives the validation it needs to when it is conducted and completed and in the public sphere, and you want it to do the work that you want it to do, right? So I that's how frame ethics, right? And I think sometimes when we have students and some faculty members, when we get approved for ethics, I think we sometimes imagine that the transition into working with communities in real time, in real life, in material reality is going to be smooth. All of the communities that I've worked with, their embedded ethics processes are way more rigorous than the kind of ethics I've had to do at the university, right? That there are going to be community-based mechanisms for building trust, for, who to work with, who do we tell what, is this an inside conversation? Is that outside? So that to understand that communities that have always been targeted or at the ills of what, some of what this questioner Andre asks in the chat, to, at the ends of the ravages of capitalism and gentrification, and, that they have, walls of trust that they need to survive. So I think that once we understand ethics in this kind of layered way, I think we can do better work. At least the possibility of starting to do work collaboratively, that's much better, right? And I think community-based research writ large, to think of doing this work over a career, I think it chips away too at the idea that the university is this hollowed place where only certain kinds of people with certain PhDs and intellectuals should reside, right? So I think I see that in tandem, that work happening together. And it's hard work, it takes time, it's difficult. So
thank you so much, Sam. I'm going to pass it off to Martin to maybe close us up. I'm looking at the time, and I think we're sadly getting to the end of the time. So just to, before I pass it to Martin, those of you who've been messaging in chat and particularly direct messaging me, I encourage you to actually, if you feel comfortable, post your question into chat so everyone can see it, just so that, those voices and those critical questions, because there's a lot of resonant threads between some of the questions I'm getting. Please post them into chat so we can see them, and I'll pass it off to you, Martin.
Well, very little more to say. This is a lovely example of learning from and with each other. You know, being able to have, you know, the collective wisdom and experience that you're all bringing from your different perspectives is very rich indeed. And I just want to thank you for taking the time to do that. To you, Jennifer, to you, Bernie, to you, Sam, and to you, Jude, especially Jude, taking the time now well into your evening time to do that. Much appreciated, and please stay tuned. We're going on to a next exciting part of our program where we are making our awards. And Joanna and Steve, I think we'll soon be going straight back to you. But again, a very sincere thanks, and I'm sure for those who were in the audience and have participated in the chat, which we'll obviously learn from as well, a very rich panel. Thank you, thank you, thank you.